Hi, my name's Brendan Malone and you're listening to The Edge of Reason, the podcast that discusses important issues without taking all day about it. Today I want to talk about the issue of eugenics. I want to talk about this issue because a couple of articles came my way in the last fortnight. They're from the British media and they explore this issue in a bit more detail. And I have to say that the content in these articles, wasn't just worrying, it was, and I would even say that calling it extremely troubling as an understatement. The first is a segment that appeared on the Newsnight program on the 28th of August. They had a little article, a documentary type article, and then they had a panel of three people who discussed the issue. Basically, the initial, or the question of the program was, is eugenics a good thing? And they even basically made the comparison. They talked about the eugenics carried out by the Nazi regime and sort of tried to suggest that, well, one of the academics anyway who was present, he was interviewed and he was part of the panel, suggested that that we shouldn't be so hard on the Nazis, that in actual fact they were onto a good thing with eugenics. I'm sure you can see why. I mean, any person of sound mind can see why such sentiment is very, very troubling. The suggestion that somehow the Nazis were onto a good thing by trying to create a master race of human beings, that somehow the Nazis were doing something good, ethical, beneficial, right, and truly loving and for the betterment of mankind by trying to eradicate the weak in our midst by deliberately destroying them, weeding them out, so that they could try and breed and bring about a new and better class of human persons. It's not just worrying, it's nonsense. It's absolute garbage to suggest that somehow that's something that we should embrace as well. Yeah, that's exactly what is happening with a lot of academics. This leads me to my second article from Professor Julian Savulescu, who was reported in the UK Telegraph as saying that so-called designer babies could be considered a moral obligation. That's a direct quote from a moral obligation, as it makes them grow up into ethically better children if we screen out the inferior ones and only give birth to the best ones. These kind of sentiments, I mean, I would suggest to you that this is the kind of thinking that goes on in your brain. You've probably been reading too much Mein Kampf, and you need to spend a little bit more time back in the real world with real people and not engaged in reading all the wrong stuff, obviously. There's something extremely troubling about suggesting that we can separate from the Nazi regime and the horrors that were carried out by the Nazi regime the notion of eugenics. And it really is like a pseudoscience, this idea that we can somehow make for ourselves a better world by ridding ourselves of all those who we consider inferior. Obviously, there's a huge problem with this kind of mentality. The first problem is what? What does it say to the disabled community? It says to the disabled community, hey, guess what? Not only are you inferior to the rest of us, but you're actually holding the human race back. And the sooner we get rid of you, the sooner things are going to start getting a lot better and brighter for us around here. The second thing is that obviously it targets an entire class of human persons and says, no, that they're not like the rest of us and they don't deserve the same rights and protections as the rest of us, and we'd be far better off if we just simply got rid of them. Third problem is, who exactly is it that gets to dictate what this particular level of perfection or this particular level of betterment that we're trying to achieve it? Who is it that decides what sort of human beings are desirable and what sort of human beings are not desirable and are unfit and must be weeded out? You see, this is the point. Ultimately, what lies at the heart of this crazy, insane, evil notion, because that's what it is. Let's call a spade a spade. You don't need to be an academic. You don't need to be a philosopher. Every man in the street can understand that targeting a human person and saying that somehow human beings are not all in fact equal and they don't all have the same worth and only certain types of human beings are valuable and others should be eradicated. Most people of common sense, if you've got half a brain and you're a person of goodwill, then you can see how crazy, how evil, how stupid an idea that really is. So let's call a spade a spade. So what lies at the heart of this? Well, I suggest there's a real problem, and it's about the question of intrinsic human worth. We've lost sight of intrinsic human worth if we are now saying that you have to meet a certain criteria in order to be valuable. In order to be an accepted member of our community, you have to have certain traits. And of course, what does this do? It denies the fundamental reality that all human persons are important, that all human persons have value, no matter who they are, no matter what their physical attributes do or don't happen to be, that we are all equal. And that diversity, I mean, this is the whole schizophrenic nature of what's going on here. In a culture that goes out of its way to claim that it celebrates diversity and that it's all about tolerance, at the same time as allowing something like, in New Zealand here, it's something around 70%. If you go to the United Kingdom, I think it's 90%. The United States, I think it's about 85% of all persons who are conceived with Down syndrome are now aborted. How is that tolerance? How is that being open to diversity? How is that welcoming diversity? It's the complete opposite of that, I would suggest to you. But we are heading, some might argue we've headed right off the cliff. The moment we've got academics openly and on major news networks like the BBC suggesting that what the Nazis did wasn't so bad and that we could learn something from them. And we've got other academics who are suggesting that it's a moral obligation to genetically screen and weed out and destroy inferior human beings before they get the chance to be born. We're in real trouble. We're in real trouble. And I would suggest to you what this indicates is that we have not learnt the lessons of history. We are simply heading down the same dark path that the Nazi regime took us down. And you can't blame the Nazis entirely for what happened there. You need to go back and understand that before Hitler even takes power, these ideas, the very same ideas we're talking about now, have begun to sow themselves within the German academic intelligentsia. They're already thinking along these lines, that there are certain human beings who have lives that are what they call devoid of value. And it's not just the Germans. This is happening in the United States. This is happening in Britain. All amongst academic circles, there is this notion. Certain academics were not, certain academics really began to seize on the idea of Darwinian evolutionary thought and said, well, let's take it to the next level. If nature's going to do certain things, why shouldn't we join the party as well? And we'll start weeding out people for ourselves. We'll introduce our own version of unnatural selection, where we'll go and select people we like, and we'll weed out those who we consider inferior. Sadly, it seems we have not learnt the lessons of history. We didn't learn the most vital lesson, probably of the last 100 years, that when you open up this door, you are opening the door to the Nazi Holocaust. That's exactly what you're doing when you start down this path. The Nazis simply took these ideologies and they extended them and they followed through to their logical outcomes. They used this as a framework, they built on it, and they just carried through with what these ideologies are all about. And the fact that we are now at a stage where we've been through that, and as human beings, we now have academics saying that we could learn something from the Nazis and their eugenics, and that perhaps not everything they did was bad in this regard, and that we could be onto something. And you've got academics saying that we have a moral obligation to do these kind of things. This is very, very troubling. And I would suggest it's time for a lot of soul searching for us as a culture, and particularly in the world of academics and bioethics, if this kind of thought is becoming more and more public and more publicized and as being something that's promoted, and you have people who are latching onto it and saying, yeah, maybe this is not a bad idea, then I would suggest we're in a pretty dark place and we've got to ask some very serious questions of ourselves as a culture. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.